Okay, comparative politics. From the text, chapter 6, non-democracies. All right, what's a non-democracy? How are we going to define it? Well, one way to define it is just negatively. A non-democracy is anything that's not democratic. Like, slightly more useful than it seems, because we can think about our definition for democracy. You needed three characteristics, a minimum level of three characteristics, and those are three qualities, and those are competition, participation, and liberty. So, if you fail to get the minimum level on one or more of those characteristics, then you're not a democracy. All right. Okay. Is that useful? Well, let's look at it this way. Moving, just sort of ignoring for now the definitions that the book gives, which are perfectly fine. Let's think about it like this. There's a lot of different ways to be non-democratic. As we know, up until recently in history, non-democracies were everywhere. It was sort of the default system, except the historical example here and there, Greece, etc. The world was non-democratic historically. So, and then what has happened since then is the number of democracies has gradually, sometimes not so gradually, increased to where much of the world is democratic in some form or another. But then still, there's a fair number of countries that certainly are not, absolutely not democratic. And then there's that group of countries that are kind of in the middle, the illiberal democracies that we've already discussed. But that's one way I want you to think about it. So what are the different ways to be non-democratic? Well, communist states. We're going to look in chapter 9 at communism and post-communist states, so we won't go into a lot of specifics here, but communist states are non-democratic. A theocracy, by definition, is non-democratic, and that is a regime founded around a holy text, the rules and laws inside of a holy text. Okay, maybe you have a military regime. That's non-democratic. Maybe you have a transitional regime. Maybe it's military for now, but the idea is it's going to become something later, but at the moment it's non-democratic. There's a lot of different ways to do it. I'm going to give you one specific one, and this is the most extreme, and I want to be careful in terms of terminology how we use this word, but a totalitarian state. Totalitarian is this word that you hear, and I want to make sure that we're using it correctly, that you've got a firm idea of what we mean by totalitarian states. This is a very small subset of non-democratic states. It's even a small subset of a dictatorship, right? A government in which much of life is controlled by one person or a very small group of people. That's a dictatorship. What's the definition between a dictatorship and a totalitarian state? Totalitarian states are very rare, and in real life, when people will often, it's a little bit like the word fascism or even socialism, people will accuse a regime, a country, a group of people as being totalitarian, when really we should be using another word. Totalitarian states are a small subset of dictatorships, but in which control is much more complete and robust and thorough and top to bottom. Every aspect, the economy, politics, society, culture, are fully controlled by the state. And quite often that there will be one person who's ultimately at the top. There's always an ideology involved. So as you see, as I'm defining it, we keep adding a few more characteristics. It's almost always one person at the top, and there is an ideology involved. That's not always the case. Ideology doesn't necessarily have to be a part of a dictatorship, but in a totalitarian state, it's definitely there. And then the final characteristics is there's enormous political violence. Okay? So what we see with totalitarian states are extremely high death tolls. So here we're talking a small handful of states. In today's world, perhaps North Korea is a totalitarian state. That's fine. Throughout history, it's the obvious examples. Go ahead and think for a second. What are some examples? And probably the ones that you're thinking in your head, I'm about to say. The Nazis, Hitler and the Nazis. That was certainly a totalitarian state. There's an ideology involved. Attempted total control of the entire society. Enormous death tolls. Of course, the number 6 million is the rough number we use for the Holocaust. And then there were, beyond Jews, there were other groups of people who were also targeted and killed by the Nazis. So 6 million there. And keep in mind, this is a very short period of time, less than 10 years, in which much really closer to 5 years, in which the Holocaust happened. Stalin. So not every Soviet leader was a totalitarian. Stalin certainly was. And what we see there, the death toll under Stalin, who ruled for a much longer time than the Nazis, decades, was in the tens of millions. The ranges on these death tolls, and you can see these in the book, will run anywhere between, for example, with Stalin, anywhere between, I think, maybe 10 and 60 million. That's an enormous difference. The difference between 10 million and 60 million is enormous. Why are those ranges so wide? Why is that range so wide? Well, this is generally what we see. Totalitarian regimes are secretive, so it's not always possible to get accurate, detailed information. You're not going to, if you're smart, you're not going to write down the names of everybody you've killed, right? Situations in which a lot of people are being killed just beyond the secrecy can be extremely chaotic, fast-moving. So that's hard to document. So that's part of the uncertainty. And then another part of the uncertainty is, what do you include in those death tolls? Are you including people who we know were purposely killed? Yes, of course, those are included. What do you do about deaths that are not necessarily intended, but they result from extreme policies? So when you include these, that's where you start to get up to the 30, 40, 50, 60 million numbers for the Soviet regime. Well, what did Stalin do that caused tens of millions of people to die? Beyond his political purges, in which he intentionally targeted, killed people, sent them off to the gulag prison camps, that sort of thing. Well, collectivization. Again, we'll talk about this in chapter 9, but Stalin and then later Mao and China both attempted to collectivize agriculture, which means switch it from a traditional situation where it's for profit and individual based into something that's collective and run by the government and not for profit, and where the government is deciding who's going to be a farmer, where they're going to farm, where they're going to live, who they're going to live with, and most importantly, what they're going to grow, when, and how. Guess what? This didn't work. It resulted in massive multiple famines. I would include those, just my opinion, I include those in the death toll, so I generally think of this in terms of the higher numbers, because was Stalin trying to kill people? Maybe, right? Doesn't matter. Well, it's such an extreme policy, and at some point he had to know that it wasn't working, right? And if he didn't know that it wasn't working for whatever set of reasons, that's still his responsibility, of course. So you see that happen under Stalin. Mao comes along in China and adjusts this a little bit, but he really romanticizes the peasants, the farmers, the traditional rural life, and he collectivizes. He has the same results. He also has a couple political purges. One of them, the Cultural Revolution, which sounds so much nicer than it was. This is basically a political purge when he goes after his enemies, the elites, academics, people in entertainment, people living in cities. Later on, the Khmer Rouge in Cambodia, a couple of decades later, they do something quite similar. And what results in Cambodia is, pound for pound, possibly the worst of these totalitarian regimes. Getting the number right off the top of my head. I think it's in the book. I don't want to give the wrong number, but quite a shockingly large percentage of Cambodians were killed in a very short period of time. There's a good book and movie from a few decades ago called The Killing Fields, which is about this time period. So the numbers, the absolute numbers in Cambodia were not 30, 40, 50 million, maybe it's 1.5, 2 million, something like that. But this is a small country with a small population that represented like a significant percentage of their people. So that's it for totalitarianism and our sort of intro to non-democracies. I'll be back. I'm going to do a couple more of these snippets on non-democracies. One of them on populism and another one on corruption. So see you for that.